Okay, we'll talk about character tests. One voice we haven't heard from, I don't think anyway, I haven't heard in this debate, is former Prime Minister John Howard. And he is the man, of course, who put in place the Pacific Solution, the temporary protection visas, all the rest of it. He was on BBC's Hard Talk this week, and he said one product of his tough policy was increased support for a higher immigration intake.
One of the outcomes of my policy in relation to that was that we ended up seeing in Australia increased public support for a high migration program and also for the maintenance of an orderly humanitarian refugee program. And on a per capita basis, under my government, it's continued under the present government, Australia takes a larger number of humanitarian refugees through the humanitarian programs of the UN than most other countries.
And the John Howard on the BBC during the week. And Paul, indeed, Australia's immigration intake did rise for a few years after the Tampa years under the coalition government, and the coalition government always said that their hard line on asylum seekers was about restoring faith and integrity in the immigration intake, not about dog whistling.
In fact, when the immigration intake is risen, there is no public commentary about it. The government doesn't go out there and sell it. The Howard government didn't. The Rudd government doesn't, because really it's not a big issue. This is an issue...
Because they weren't Sri Lankans arriving on leaky boats.
Well, because they weren't whipping it up. And that's the reality. I mean, 2001 was a beat-up. It was a beat-up. The Tampa posed no threat to our country. The refugees, most of those refugees are here now. The reality is he exploited that issue successfully in his election. Now, I think Australians have actually moved on from 2001. I was expecting a backlash from my membership over this issue. My membership are predominantly male, living in regional areas. Most of them are over 45. But I was at a large conference of my membership yesterday in Newcastle, and I was genuinely surprised by the support that I had from my membership on my position on this issue, because I think the electorate is smarter, and this is what I think the government's got wrong. I think they have expected the same backlash in 2001. Frankly, people that vote on border protection issues don't vote Labor anyway. And in terms of the broader population, I think...
Well, they did. That's where Howard Battlers came from.
I think people who go to the ballot box thinking about race and thinking about refugees don't vote Labor. I genuinely believe that.
Well, I think there's some challenge to that from the change in the vote. And as I say, where Howard Battlers came from was a lot on that issue,
The soft vote, absolutely. The 2001 soft vote, but the hard line vote, absolutely not.
Can I just say, on John Howard's comments, I mean, I think it is true that his hard line in 2001 on border protection led to him being able, without much media commentary, to steadily increase Australia's immigration intake. It's horses for courses. That was then. Now, as a consequence of that, I think that public acceptance of the reality over time of an increased immigration level, a greater level of multiculturalism through that as well, we are at a point where public opinion isn't such now that it is what it was in 2001. So I think Howard can take credit for removing public concern about an increase in an immigration level, ironically because of his tough border protection policy. But the tough border protection policy can now go because public attitudes have changed over time.
Peter, you've written this morning fairly controversially that the Pacific solution should be brought back because it would actually be preferable for those on board the Oceanic Viking than the Indonesian solution. Really?
Well, I think they would. I mean, I take the view that neither solution should be in place and they should be allowed into the country and be assessed here. That said, we don't have that choice at the moment between the two major parties. And what the opposition are saying when they do sort of allude to what they would do as an alternative, they're saying that they wouldn't have changed things. Well, the change was Kevin Rudd removing the Pacific solution. And I'm simply making the point that if that's your binary choice, if you're an asylum seeker, where would you rather be? Would you rather be in the option that Kevin Rudd provides, which is an Indonesian detention centre run by Indonesians, an underdeveloped country with a low standard of living, or would you rather be in a Nauru detention centre run by the Australians? And I don't think that there's really any choice in that. In my view. The only way that Kevin Rudd can moralise that he is somehow more humanitarian than the opposition on this issue is if he accepts that he, as an asylum seeker, would prefer to be stuck in Indonesia in an Indonesian-run detention centre.
Glenn, does Peter have a point? Is there any support at all for a return to the Pacific solution? And the corollary of that, I suppose, is the Indonesian solution at the moment in tatters.
You've only got to look at the front page of the Australian today, where the most senior spokesman for the Indonesian Foreign Ministry has flatly contradicted the undertakings that the Australian government gave in the Parliament, both from Kevin Rudd and from Stephen Smith during the week, that women and children on the Oceanic Viking would be kept out of the detention centre that the males were being sent to and housed in community housing. And the Indonesian government saying, well, that's just not the case. There are provisions inside the detention centre for women and children to be kept separate, but they'll be inside the detention centre. And the fact of the matter is that where would you rather be, as Peter points out? Would you rather be in an Australian-run, Australian-funded detention centre on Nauru, or an Indonesian-run and Australian-funded detention centre in Indonesia? Well, as he said, given the binary choice, I think I know how most of those asylum seekers would vote on that vote. But what my point is that the continued contradictions on detail, handling, strategy from the Indonesian government of the Australian government's approach and statements suggest it is in tatters. And as I think Tony Abbott made a very good point during the week, and it's this, that the approach we're seeing through the Oceanic Viking is an approach that's basically ad hoc. It's boat by boat. It's not a policy. It's a response to individual boat crises.
Well, I also think that whilst I don't completely disagree with Peter's article in the Oz today, it's a bit of a false debate. I mean, I think both solutions aren't a solution. This is another classic case of Orwellian words about solutions. These aren't solutions. I have grave concerns about sending refugees to a country which isn't signatory to the UN Convention on the Rights of Refugees. And that is an issue for Australia in terms of the way that we deal with international law. I think a lot more effort needs to be put on pressure on the Indonesian government to become signatory to the convention. That will actually be a significant factor in stopping people in Indonesia, because once refugees have rights within that country and can seek asylum there, a large number will stay there.
It's hard to see why that's going to happen suddenly, though.
Well, this is about the rule of international law. I mean, Indonesia had been a pariah globally for a long period of time. They were out of the UN for a long period of time. They are developing their own democratic political system. They are moving fastly. They're a good news beacon in the Southeast Asia in that regard, and part of that needs to be complying with global standards and global law, and that's something that Rudd should be pushing very heavily with President.
And what a great opportunity missed, by the way, particularly by the opposition. If they'd wanted to do something other than say our alternative is going back to more hardline policy, their alternative could be trying to seek Indonesian acceptance into the convention, etc., etc. But no, they've chosen to try to emulate the Howard years, and I think to their detriment politically, even though Kevin Rudd is in so much trouble.
Okay, we're just about out of time. Glenn, just politically from you, you clearly think this has damaged the Prime Minister. What about the opposition? Has Malcolm Turnbull, is he making much ground here, making much sense here, really?
Well, two things. I mean, I don't think the opposition comes out of it with that much credit. But look, the situation is they're an opposition. They're making hay while the sun shines out of an issue that they think the government is vulnerable on. Should they have a position on this? Well, it depends on your point of view whether opposition should try and govern from opposition. But the key weakness in the opposition's position is that they actually allowed the dismantling of tougher border protection measures to go through the Parliament. They supported the abolition of temporary protection visas, for example, so they can hardly stand up on their hind legs now and complain that that Kevin Rudd has got the welcome mat out. I would say one thing that we haven't really canvassed here in terms of political implications of all this, and that is, look, if Malcolm Turnbull does not get a bounce out of this in the opinion polls, in the next set of polls, if he's not shown to have made some ground against Kevin Rudd, then I think it will increase the sense of panic inside the Liberal Party about his leadership, because if this doesn't work, nothing will.
And that sounds like next week's Friday panel. Peter, Paul and Glenn, thanks very much for being with us on Breakfast. Peter Van Onselen is contributing editor with the Australian newspaper. Glenn Milne is the political columnist for News Limited Papers. And Paul House is the National Secretary of the Australian Workers' Union.